today, fella?
Modbury.
And why are we here?
Modbury is about 12 miles from Plymouth, and two events happened here in the Civil War that had great significance for Plymouth. I know it sounds odd, but it's true. In 1642, at the beginning, for Plymouth, the beginning of the Civil War, Sir Rolf Hopton took his Cornish army of around 4,500 men and marched east, crossed the Tamar, despite his men not wanting to, because these soldiers fought for Cornwall only. He persuaded them to march into Devon and blockade Plymouth at Plympton. He occupied Plympton and blockaded Plymouth from the other side of the Plym. To the Royalists in the South Hams, although Devon was predominantly parliamentarian, a lot of the nobility in this area, in the South Hams, sided with the king. So Hopton's occupation of Plympton with a strong army gave the local Royalists here chance to call a meeting of all their soldiers, gather a posse in Modbury. So they brought all their retainers and the locals together at Modbury in December 1642. The nobility didn't know what to do with this mass of men. There were about 1,500 to 2,000 altogether. They came for a good time. They were drinking, they were eating, they weren't trained soldiers. In Plymouth, this worried the High Command. So they had a meeting late in the night of December the 6th. The Mayor of Plymouth, Colonel William Ruthven, and Colonel Alexander Carew, Sir Alexander Carew, and other officers planned what to do. How can we break up this? Because if these Royalists organised, they could reinforce Hopton and invest Plymouth closer. They could move north of Plymouth and tighten their grip on Plymouth. So they decided to make a raid. That night, Colonel William Ruthven led between 300 and 500 horse and dragoons out of Plymouth. But he couldn't go directly east. He couldn't go through Plympton. He decided to go north, where the Royalist outposts were few and far between. So he rode north of Plymouth, out towards Shaw, came over the moors via Ivy Bridge, and by just after dawn on December the 7th, the morning, his men reached the high ground above Modbury. The Royalists were just waking up. Their leaders were having a meeting at the Champernowne Mansion, deciding what to do. They were in a council of war. Sir Rolf Hopton was here the day before, and some of his leading generals to sort of coerce the Devon Royalists and tell them what we're going to do when they, get together. We're going to bring them to Plymouth. That Hopton left, leaving the Devon Royalists in the house themselves. At this time, someone gave a warning that the parliamentarians were above them, Roundhead Horse. These men, Ruthven led his men down the hill, scattered the posse in no time. These men were untrained soldiers, so you got 1,500 men scattering in all directions. There's a place over there just behind this church called Runaway Lane. Now, although it is more significant with the Second Battle of Modbury, I believe a lot of soldiers fled down that way, and it had the name by then. It was called Runaway Lane shortly after this fight, rather than the second fight, because the second battle was more organised. These men fled. The leaders of the Devon posse, the nobility, blockaded themselves in the Champernowne Mansion, which is just to the north of this church.
How far away is it, Phil?
2 minutes walk.
Close.
The Champernowne Mansion was very close, near the old priory. It was the home of Sir Henry Champernowne, a royalist. And in the house were Sir Henry, there was Edmund Fortescue of Berry Pomeroy, his son Edward, the Sheriff of Devon, Sir John Fortescue. These men and a lot of other officers were blockaded themselves in this house. When the posse scattered, a lot of the Plymouth soldiers took to plundering. They came to this church, St George's Church behind me, and attacked the church, ransacking it and damaging the effigies inside to the dead of the Champernowne family, because they did not like royalists at all. And any church belonging to the royalists, they would sort of ransack. Then they besieged the house. Ruthven decided not to launch an attack against the house because it was too well defended and he would lose a lot of men, so he set fire to the outbuildings. Now these outbuildings caught alight pretty quick, and the flames moved towards the house because it wasn't a big house. I think it was known as Manor Court in those days, and the royalists inside gave up. I mean, they feared they were going to be burned to death, so they surrendered to Ruthven. Ruthven gathered his men together, collected the prisoners, and this great bag of prisoners were then marched to Dartmouth, Captain Thomas Drake and Captain William Gould were involved in this. Captain William Gould went on to become governor of Plymouth later. Another man called Thompson, George Thompson, was another cavalry commander here. These men took the prisoners to Dartmouth and sent them to London. These were then dispersed to several different prisons. There's the one in Southwark, there's the King's Bench and Winchester House. They were split up, so they couldn't plot together. Edmund Fortescue was in Windsor Castle, was kept there for a while, and there was a bit of graffiti on the window, one of the windows at Windsor, that said, Edmund Fortescue, prisoner here, December 1642. So we know exactly where he was. The Plymouth men then rowed back to Plymouth. Well, they went to Dartmouth, like I said, and then they took ship back to Plymouth. And that was the end of this raid. Although it was small, it was a most significant raid, because after this, Hopton knew that with only 4,500 men, he couldn't really stay around Plymouth. So he withdrew and decided to attack Exeter, which failed also. But more of that in the second video.
Thank you very much.
How was that, Steve? Oh.